Hey everybody, welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we'll be watching World War II Part 1 by Oversimplified. Now this is one of their most popular videos, and for good reason. Of course, this is a monumental conflict, and there is a lot to cover. I'm excited to get into it. Before I do, I'd appreciate it if you guys would leave a like on this video, subscribe to my channel, and you can become a YouTube channel member if you'd like to see reactions like this early and get access to a bunch of exclusive videos. Now, with all of that out of the way, let's jump right into this reaction.
It's 1902. A young man by the name of Benito Mussolini moves from Italy to Switzerland to avoid military service. He gets big into socialism, working for trade unions, writing for socialist newspapers, advocating a violent overthrow of European monarchies, the whole shebang. This gets him in a bit of trouble with the Swiss police, so he gets arrested, sent back to Italy, set free, returns to Switzerland, is arrested again, goes back to Italy again, completes his military service after previously avoiding it, and then after a brief stint as an elementary school teacher, he finally returns to work as an avid...
Imagine that. It's decades after the war. You're an old Italian talking to your kids and you say, hey, my elementary school teacher, his name was Mr. Mussolini. That's quite a story to tell.
Socialist. His speeches and journalistic abilities made him famous among Italian socialists. He was anti-war, so when Italy colonized Libya in 1910, he rioted and got arrested. Then World War I came along, and once again he protested Italy's involvement. But then he thought, wait a minute, this war could bring about the social climate needed to overthrow European monarchies and bring about the socialist revolution everywhere. And suddenly he was pro-war. But his fellow socialists didn't like his new pro-war stance, so they kicked him out of the party. So then he said,
you know, there's a sort of interesting mix of perspectives among the socialists of the time regarding the First World War. Depends where you look, what party you're looking at. Right? A lot of them, of course, were sort of inherently opposed to the conflict, but what you see is a lot of these socialist movements, especially the more social democratic movements, they end up sort of getting nationalist, and they end up supporting the war, like the Social Democratic Party in Germany, right? So supporting it for a different reason than Mussolini here. And then you have some socialist or communist figures, like a Lenin, for example, who see an opportunity in the conflict to sort of overthrow the global capitalist order. So there's sort of an interesting mix of opinions there among the socialists and communists of the time.
you know what? I'm done with socialism. We need something new, not based on class divisions tearing us apart, but based on unity through nationality. We'll conquer the Mediterranean and reunite all Italian peoples just like the days of the Roman Empire. I'll call it fascismo, and it will guide the Italian nation to greatness.
Uh-oh. Well, you see, these fascist figures, some of them come from these more working class or leftist backgrounds, and they become disaffected, and then they move to the far right. I mean, you're probably not going to be a fascist unless you're disaffected in one way or another. But then a lot of these fascist figures were also conservatives or traditionalists who just became increasingly more far right over time.
That's all well and good, Mr. Mussolini, but what kind of haircut am I giving you? Let's go with bold. Italy had been on the winner's side in World War I, and they hoped they were going to get a lot out of it, but in the end, they only got a little.
Yeah, I mean, Italy's involvement with the First World War is sort of an interesting one, right? So before the war, they are a member of the Triple Alliance, which is this defensive pact between Austria, Germany, and Italy. Now, you might notice that they ended up on opposite sides of the war, right? So the war begins, and Italy's basically like, I don't really want to get involved. I mean, they say the pact is defensive, and Austria and Germany are waging an offensive war, so they do not feel like they need to be involved. Now, Austria and Germany were obviously not super thrilled about that, but initially, Italy stays out of it. And then, as the war progresses, not only do they stay out of the conflict, but they actually join up with the other side. They join up with the Entente powers, right? And so they end up on the winning side of the conflict. However, they're sort of similar to Japan in this respect, where they join up with the winning side, right? They're on the victorious side of the war, and they go in expecting to gain a lot of territory. See, Italy expects to gain a lot of territory through the Balkans. Japan expects to gain a lot of colonies. And both of these countries do not necessarily get what they wanted. They get a lot less. So they exit the war feeling pretty disappointed, and this sets both of them on, well, sort of a similar path to Germany, even though they are on the winning side of the war, whereas Germany is on the losing side.
And they felt cheated. On top of that, a bad economy and weak governments meant that the Italian people were a little unhappy. So when Mussolini came along and said that he could fix everything, his fascist movement gained a lot of support.
Well, right. I mean, the conditions are correct. Like I said, you've got to be pretty disaffected to become a fascist. And so in Italy, you've got this general feeling of dissatisfaction. You've got weak governments. You've got a bad economy. I mean, all the classic ingredients that lead to the rising of a far-right movement like we see here.
1922, he went to the king and said, "Make me prime minister or I'll make me prime minister." And the king said, "You and what army?"
Ooh.
This army.
Yeah.
Fair enough. Then he went about establishing a dictatorship with himself at its center. Europe had its first fascist dictator. Next up, Germany. Germany had been on the loser's side, and they got absolutely wrecked by the Treaty of Versailles. They lost territory, had to demilitarize the Rhineland, had to reduce their army to just 100,000 men, couldn't have an air force, had to pay the Allies a huge amount of money that it didn't have, and a new rule was established that every Englishman withheld the right to walk into the center of Berlin, pick out any German they wanted, and spank the hell out of them. I made that last one up, but it helps you understand how all this felt to Germans.
Right, so, yeah, Germany as a nation was feeling very humiliated in this moment. I mean, the Italians and the Japanese thought they were disappointed with the outcome of the war. Germany, it goes a whole lot worse. Right? Germany enters the conflict, this great military power, perhaps the single greatest military power at that moment, until the United States gets involved and builds up its own forces. But they end up losing. And at the Treaty of Versailles, they face some pretty dire consequences. Right? There are, of course, these massive material costs. They're forced to pay these gigantic reparations. Their industrial heartland is occupied by France, and of course their industrial capacity is reduced and put towards paying off those reparations, and their military is greatly decreased. And then, along with the material consequences, there's also the infamous war guilt clause, which is basically the Entente powers saying, "Hey, Germany, you're going to take full responsibility for this war." And, you know, they sign it, and so they do. At least the government of Germany does, right? A lot of Germans are not a fan of that. Look, does Germany hold part of the responsibility for the First World War? Yes, absolutely. But so do a couple other countries. There's a lot of responsibility to go around. So Germans are left feeling like this is incredibly unfair. Of course, they're living through a bad economy, these materially pretty devastating consequences. Things are not going well. And you have the emergence of this stabbed in the back myth, right? Where a lot of this anger that is brewing is directed against their own government, the Weimar Republic. Now, the whole idea of the stabbed in the back myth is a lot of these Germans, particularly Germans who had served in the army during the conflict, they feel like Germany could have kept fighting and they could have won the war. But their cowardly government sold them out by signing this deal. Right? And they feel like that government was made up of socialists, communists, and Jews, right? And that's where a lot of the anger is directed. And of course, that anger is directed at the current Weimar government, right? And so a lot of these people are becoming increasingly radicalized. They blame their own government for getting very angry, and some of them will begin to take action. And by that, I mean violent action. And this is where we get a lot of these far-right groups, one of whom, of course, are the Nazis.
On top of that, a bad economy and weak governments meant that when a small angry man with a silly mustache came along and said that he could fix everything, the German people loved it. Hitler had been a soldier during World War I, and he was crazy patriotic, and nobody was madder than him about Germany's humiliation.
Oh, yeah.
He helped start a new political party, and in 1923 attempted a march on Munich with his boys. And then he got arrested. But his popularity grew and grew.
Yeah, his sentence was pretty light. I mean, there's a lot of things here. One is that a lot of these far-right movements are made up of former soldiers, like Adolf here, right? You have what are called the Freikorps, which are these bands of demilitarized soldiers who are very angry about everything that's happened. They're becoming increasingly radicalized and far-right, and so they take violent action in the streets, right? These type of guys are the basis for a party like the Nazi Party. You also have, like I said, Hitler got a pretty light sentence, Now, there are a lot of people, of course, who didn't like Hitler, but the still pretty conservative establishment of Germany at that time, they didn't mind him so much. They give him a light sentence. Of course, in the end, the conservatives are going to end up essentially trying to co-opt Hitler, team up with him, and that's not going to work for them, right? So Hitler, he's finding, if not allies, then people who are willing to give him a pass in places of power. He's increasing his popularity, and of course, he's controlling violence in the streets. And along with all this dissatisfaction and the bad economy, this accounts in many ways for his rise to power.
And in 1933, the president made him chancellor. He believed he was Germany's great destined savior, and he went full megalomaniac, establishing a dictatorship with himself at its center. Europe had fascist dictator number 2. Hitler and Mussolini had a lot of the same ideas, but more importantly, they had this.
These fascist leaders, there's always a combination in the rise to power of a legitimately popular base of support, some real democratic support, and then an authoritarian seizing of power. Right? They need some base of support, and they have it, right? Well, we've talked about the reasons why, but then they're also taking this authoritarian action to subvert the democratic institutions, or even just the institutions of their country. They're not always that democratic.
The same enemies, and they started to get along. Anyone else want to be friends? Franco? No? You good? I do. Who's that? It's Japan, and they've taken over northern China. Let's rewind a bit. Japan had isolated itself from the rest of the world for over 200 years until the Americans showed up and said, you're going to trade with us and you're going to like it. Then the Western powers imposed a bunch of unequal treaties, meaning Japan's economy was bust. They also had no natural resources, so they decided to go get some. They went to war with China to gain a sphere of influence over Korea, and they took a bunch of China's stuff. But then the West said, hey, cut that out. And since Japan couldn't take on the West, they said, okay, I guess we'll just go home. Wait a minute, what are you doing? Taking advantage of a weakened China and setting up spheres of influence. But I was the one who weakened them. We know. And you guys didn't let me have anything. We know. That seems unfair. We don't think so.
Right, so Japan, is isolationist for a while. That isolation is broken. And then Japan is very much at risk of being dominated by these Western powers. Just look around the world. This is the era of colonialization, the era of imperialism. And so Japan is like, uh-oh, we got to do something about this. And so through the Meiji Restoration, what Japan does is they very rapidly modernize and militarize themselves. They create a modern government, a modern economy, and most importantly, a modern military. Now, through this rapid modernization, Japan increasingly becomes more and more militaristic, as a lot of these countries do, and so they want to get into the imperial game. They want to become a colonial power, like their sort of Western counterparts. Now, initially, when they tried to do this, the Western powers are sort of like, meh, that's not going to happen. Sorry, Japan, but it's not really appropriate for you to be taking territory. But Japan looks around, and all of these European and the United States, all these Western countries are doing just that. So they're feeling like they're already being treated unfairly, right? Because they're an Asian power, even though they just want to be an imperialist like everybody else.
Okay, see ya. So Japan thought, screw this, and went to war with Russia, and stunned everyone by actually winning. Then they fully annexed Korea, but they didn't stop there. In World War I, they took Germany's colonies and islands in Asia, and then in an incident that was maybe staged by the Japanese army, a bomb blew up a Japanese train in Manchuria, giving them an excuse to launch an invasion and take over. So here's the situation.
Yeah, so the Western powers continually tell Japan that's not appropriate, which of course is the height of hypocrisy, right? They're all taking foreign territory. They're all doing a lot of imperialism. They tell Japan they can't do it. Now look, all of this is bad, but it's sort of hard to take that from these European powers when they're doing exactly the same thing. So Japan doesn't take it. They don't listen. They say, we don't care what you say. We're going to keep taking colonies. Korea, China, right? They're now fighting with China. In fact, years before the Second World War starts, Japan is already in all-out warfare with China. And some people actually say that that is when the Second World War begins. Not in 1939 in Europe, but a couple years earlier out in Asia. Now, whether you believe that or not, clearly this is a very important part of the conflict. Right? Japan has stepped away from the international community. They leave the League of Nations, just sort of like the UN at that time, because the League of Nations keeps telling them to stop conquering foreign territories, Japan leaves, and they continue to do that. And now they're fighting pretty intensely with China, and now Japan is on a similar track to these countries we've already talked about, Italy and Germany. They're becoming increasingly right-wing, increasingly militaristic.
Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, and Japan all believe they're racially superior, all feel hostility towards the Allies, and all want to militarize and take over more stuff. And so they did. Let's start with Germany. Hitler hated the Treaty of Versailles, and now he was ready to begin undoing it. In complete violation of the treaty, the first Luftwaffe squadrons were set up, conscription was introduced, and he pimped up his army. The Allies did nothing. Then Hitler sent his army back into the demilitarized Rhineland, giving orders to immediately retreat if the Allies showed up. The Allies did nothing.
Right, and this is where we see the issue begin, where Hitler is taking all of these belligerent actions, and they will become increasingly more belligerent as time continues. And what we see from the Allies is appeasement, or frankly, even before appeasement, just total inaction. Right? Hitler is building up his army. He's not supposed to be able to do that. He's retaking the Rhineland. He's not supposed to do that. And as they just pointed out early on, Hitler's idea is if he sees any resistance, he'll back up. Right? So if the Allies resisted even a little bit, then he's not going to do it. He'll take another course of action. But they don't. Right? And this is partially because they don't want to get into a conflict with Germany. Also, a lot of people feel like the Treaty of Versailles was pretty unfair, right? So when Hitler's building up his army and retaking the Rhineland, a lot of people are sort of like, maybe that's, not such, maybe this treaty was unfair to Germany. Now, of course, we all know what direction this is heading. This is all heading in a really horrific direction. And of course, they couldn't see the future at that time. But it does make you think if the Allies had resisted, who knows, maybe there still would have been a war, but things would have gone very, very differently.
With his military re-strengthened, he could now move on to step 2. He wanted to rapidly increase the Aryan population, and to do so, he needed Lebensraum, or in other words, he would have to take over the world. But for now, a good portion of Europe would do, and he began eyeing up his neighbors.
Well, right. So Hitler, he writes about all of this, Lebensraum, or living space, Hitler's idea that, of course, he sees the Aryan people, the pure Aryan Germans, as supreme. He wants them to basically take over everything, but to do that, they need living space, right? Now, for Hitler, like he said, that could be the whole world, but initially, what he's looking at is Eastern Europe. He wants to take over the territories east of Germany, some of which, of course, have German populations. We'll see that in the case of Austria and the Czechs over here. This is going to be a pretty prominent moment, but also really the entirety of Central and Eastern Europe. Hitler wants to, we'll see what he does, which is kills, sends to concentration camps, or kicks out these sort of local Slavic populations, and he wants to settle Germans in these areas.
The Allies finally started to get worried, so they implemented a fairly useless diplomatic strategy called appeasement, and it went a little something like this. Hitler would say, "I want that thing," and the Allies would say, "You can't have that thing." "Okay, you can have that thing, but no more."
Right.
"I want that thing." And repeat. In 1938, Hitler's army marched into Austria and just took it, with no resistance. Boom, this is Germany now. Next, he demanded to be given the Sudetenland, an area of Czechoslovakia with many ethnic Germans. The Allies held a meeting with Hitler in Munich.
And this is a much bigger one, right? Austria is ethnically German. There's a fair amount of support in Austria for this action, right? However, out in Czechoslovakia, there is a population of ethnic Germans in the Sudetenland, but the Slovaks, and the Czechs, who are close to the action, they're not so thrilled about this. They're saying, hey, wait a moment, you're just going to let them take some of our country? Well, don't worry, the Allies are bringing together a conference. They're going to sort this out, so let's see what they do.
And said, look, we're going to give you what... Hang on, this meeting is about my territory. Shouldn't I come to the meeting too? Anyway, we're going to give you what you want. Really? Yeah. Just like that? Yep. What's the catch? Just sign this piece of paper promising you won't invade the rest of Czechoslovakia.
Oh, man.
Okay. Then Chamberlain returned home victorious, waving his signed piece of paper in the air, declaring crisis to be averted and the continuation of world peace. And we built a statue of Chamberlain in his honor. And every day on the 30th of September, we celebrate Chamberlain Day. Hitler's invading the rest of Czechoslovakia. What? He's invading the rest of Czechoslovakia.
Yeah, so of course this is a very infamous moment, right? Where the Allies get together and Neville Chamberlain is like, okay, Hitler, you know what? we'll give you the Sudetenland bravely, but you got to agree not to invade the rest of the country. And Hitler's like, sure, man, absolutely. And Chamberlain comes back with this piece of paper and says, peace in our times. I have achieved eternal peace, everybody. Hail me as a hero. And then this is exactly what happens, right? Because, Hitler's not going to hold to that agreement, obviously. He's made it pretty clear what his plan is. He wants to conquer all of the territories around Germany. A piece of paper is not going to stop him. Like I said, this becomes a very infamous moment in Neville Chamberlain's quickly declining career.
Oh. You lied to me. What do you expect? I'm Hitler. Not to be outdone, Mussolini also wanted to get in on the action. He thought to himself, isn't there a not yet colonized nation somewhere which is so under...
I mean, Mussolini definitely is outdone. If we're talking about the militarism of this era, Japan and Germany are definitely better at that than Italy is.
...developed that the people would be defending themselves against our tanks with literal bows and arrows and wooden spears? Oh, there is? Fantastic. And so he took it. Italy also wanted to control the entrance to the Adriatic Sea, so they occupied Albania. Then, in another incident which was maybe staged by the Japanese, gunfire was exchanged by Japanese and Chinese troops at the Marco Polo Bridge, and the Japanese launched yet another invasion against China.
All of these incidents that seemingly just happen on the spot, there's some planning beforehand, right? Either from high-up Japanese authorities, or sometimes from officers who want to increase this conflict and expand Japan. And like I was saying earlier, for some people, this is when the Second World War truly begins, and it sort of expands from there. Once again, whether you agree with that or not, this is a big moment, and I think oftentimes the European theater of the conflict gets a lot more attention than the Pacific or the Asian theater of the war. But of course, this is an extremely important moment in the move towards that global warfare.
They swept through Beijing and Shanghai, and then advanced through the Yangtze Valley to China's then capital, Nanking. It was here that saw the worst of Japan's shocking atrocities committed against the Chinese people.
Yeah.
Back in Europe, Germany and Italy made their relationship status official by signing the Pact of Steel. Then, Hitler turned his eyes towards Poland and the hated Polish corridor splitting Germany in two. At this point, the Allies really had to put their foot down, and they warned him that an invasion of Poland would mean war. Hitler had planned to continue his advance eastward, but he didn't want to end up fighting a war on two fronts. So for now, he made an alliance with Stalin, saying, how about we both invade Poland and split it between the two of us, and I definitely won't not refrain from not betraying you sometime in the future. Sounds good.
Of course, this was a very shocking moment, really for everybody. Hitler hated communists. He'd made that pretty clear in just about all of his speeches. I mean, like I said earlier, this whole stabbed in the back myth. The perceived enemies of Germany, internally, were Jews, of course, but also socialists and communists and liberals, but really communists were one of the big enemies. And so Hitler hated the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union hated the Nazis, so this was a really shocking move. It really surprised everybody, but, I mean, Hitler saw their interests aligned for this moment. He wanted to conquer more territory in the East. He knew to do so would be running up against the Soviet Union. He did not want to fight them, at least right now, as long as he was going to be fighting the Western allies as well, and so he makes this deal, which, like I said, really shocked everybody.
This new alliance stunned the West.
Yeah.
On the 1st of September 1939, German troops entered Poland, and Britain and France declared war on Germany.
And of course, even though the Soviets did not like the Nazis, the Soviet Union under Stalin was perfectly happy to sign this deal because they were an expansionist power as well. They wanted to conquer more of this territory.
The Poles fought hard, but they were no match for the two giants crashing down on them from either side. Then came a period known as the Phony War, where everyone just sort of sat around not doing much. The French had launched a small invasion into the Saarland, but they maintained mostly defensive positions, and after a while decided to just turn around and call it a day. Speaking of France, the French were still super proud of their victory in World War I, and they hadn't really moved on from it. They still used horses, they dispatched messages by motorbike instead of using radio, orders from the commander-in-chief were usually pretty vague, and the troops were rarely inspected. They built a line of defenses along their German border, but didn't bother extending it all the way to the Channel, and they wouldn't launch artillery strikes against Germany out of fear of being retaliated against. In a war.
Yeah, so they're just not really ready for what this war is going to be. Like he said, they're sort of resting on their laurels from the First World War, even though that was a brutal conflict on both sides. I'm not sure if there's too much to be proud of, really, in that conflict. So they're like, well, do we really have to get into this now? They're not ready for what's coming, which is Germany has been building up its military capacity, and it's got its plan again to hit France in its weak spot, right? Which, they've got this Maginot Line, but they're not entirely defended. They're, of course, defended along their border with Germany, but you might notice France has some other neighbors a little further to the north, and Germany's going to take advantage of that.
They didn't want to attack the enemy, and at first the UK wasn't much better. Chamberlain still naively hoped that the war could be ended diplomatically. Instead of bombing raids, the RAF dropped propaganda leaflets over German cities, which one air marshal said likely did nothing but provide the continent with toilet paper for the duration of the war. They also only sent 200,000 men to France, while the French had mobilized millions. Both Britain and France wanted to avoid a repeat of the First World War, and so they wanted to keep the war as far from home as possible. So they turned their eyes north, towards Norway. Neutral Sweden was exporting iron ore to Germany through neutral Norway, so the Allies asked them if they could please stop exporting iron ore to Germany, but this request was refused. Then, the Soviet Union attacked Finland, so the Allies said, how about we land troops in Norway and move them across Sweden to go help out your good pal Finland, and along the way maybe take control of all your airfields. But Norway and Sweden still said no. So the UK mined the waters around Norway to force any transport ships into international waters, and they also attacked a German tanker they found in the area. Hitler realized what the Allies were up to, and he quickly moved to secure his supply of iron ore. He launched an invasion through Denmark into Norway.
So this is where, once again, you can see that Hitler, he's ready for what's coming. He knows what kind of war this is going to be. The Allied powers do not. I mean, they take some action against Norway, but they're just not willing to take the big step, which Hitler is. He's willing to invade and take over these ports, right? So once again, the Allies, they're sort of like, we don't really want this to get crazy, but Germany, they know where it's going, and they're willing to take that action. And of course they are. They've got Hitler leading them.
The Allies rushed to land troops at key ports along the coast, but Germany had taken control of Norway's airfield, and their air superiority decided the fight. The Allies had to retreat. After this slightly embarrassing failure, Chamberlain resigned and was replaced with Winston Churchill, who had a slightly different approach to dealing with the Germans. Hitler's overall strategy was similar to Germany's First World War strategy. Attack France, defeat France, knocking out the UK in the process, then turn on the Soviet Union and win the war. During the phony war, the Allies had given Hitler time to prepare his forces. Now, he was ready to attack. The Allies had wanted to place troops in Belgium, but Belgium had refused, and in a move that surprised pretty much no one, Hitler launched an invasion to get around France's defenses. The Allies charged into Belgium at full.
Once again, like they said, we're seeing a pretty similar plan to the First World War, repurposed, and you could say done a lot more effectively by Germany. And the Allies, now look, I don't know, I'm not saying they should have necessarily, occupied Belgium, but once again, they are not really acting on the severity of what's going to come, right? Germany, under Hitler, they're willing to do anything, because it's Hitler. Whereas the Allies, they're still sort of holding back. Well, they're about to see the consequences of that.
Speed to meet the German invasion head-on, and it looked like a repeat of the First World War was coming. But this time, Hitler had a trick up his sleeve. Blitzkrieg. As the Germans advanced, they sent thousands of refugees westward, slowing down the Allies. Then, to the south, the French had left the Ardennes, an area full of hills and forests, pretty underdefended, because they thought it was naturally impenetrable. Well, the Germans were about to penetrate it with everything they had. They smashed 50 Wehrmacht divisions through and encircled the Allied armies at lightning speed.
Well, and it's this Blitzkrieg, lightning war. The difference between this and the First World War, even though the plan overall seems similar, is Germany is using this strategy with these very quickly moving armored units, right? Armored units with infantry units. They're able to very quickly push far more, like I said, quickly than anyone on the Allied side was expecting, and they're able to extremely rapidly push forward and encircle the Allies, right? They were not ready for this.
The best of the Allied forces were now trapped. The Germans squeezed in from all sides.
We see in the First World War, no one's really ready for the style of warfare that it's going to bring. Everyone has to adapt over time. Well, for the Second World War, I've been sort of making this point, but Germany is ready, right? They are ready for this new style of combat, and the Allies in this moment, they're not.
taking out France's best armies and nearly wiping out the British too, but they managed to make a desperate last-minute escape at Dunkirk, with British civilian ships even making the perilous journey to bring their young men home. With most of the French forces depleted, the Germans breezed through, taking Paris, and France fell. What the Germans couldn't do in World War I, Hitler had done just like that.
Yeah.
Hitler hoped that with the fall of France, the UK would also lose hope and sue for peace. But quite annoyingly, it didn't, and he needed to secure the Western Front, so he tried to force them into submission.
Yeah, I mean, you gotta give credit to the Brits here. They held out essentially on their own, just waiting for more allies to join the war. And they're getting pretty relentlessly bombed during this period, though of course the RAF is fighting back, but they're this little island just resisting themselves, right? That's quite an impressive feat against the might of what is quickly becoming a German empire that is conquering a good chunk of Europe.
With mind games. The UK were now all alone, and Hitler wanted to emphasize that. First of all, just before France fell, Italy finally declared war on the Allies, making the UK's situation even worse. Next, instead of just occupying all of France, Hitler occupied the coastal areas for defense, but allowed France to continue its existence as a German puppet state. This way, it looked like the UK's old ally had decided to switch sides. Hitler also hoped that the UK wouldn't attack any of her old allies' navy bases or colonies in Africa, giving Hitler an extra line of defense to the south. But the UK made sure to respond to this by sailing down to France's navy base in Algeria and wrecking a bunch of ships. So,
I mean, I think this is where Britain under Churchill, they show they have understood the severity of the conflict, right? Up until this point, you know, as we've seen, Germany's been ready, Britain and France have not. But now, with some new leadership, and they've been shown how extreme the situation is, Britain's willing to take those actions they wouldn't have previously. So they go and they sink France's fleet, right? That's something. That's the sort of restraint they would have shown earlier, but now the situation is serious. Britain's in a lot of trouble, and so they're like, all right, well, we got to do this. And so they take that action that Hitler thought they wouldn't be willing to take, sort of based on their previous actions.
have at it. Hitler then began laying down plans for an invasion of Great Britain. Before German troops could land on British soil, he would first need air and naval superiority across the Channel. Waves of German bombers came, while the completely outnumbered RAF worked bravely around the clock in an attempt to quell the German attacks. At first, the Luftwaffe targeted British ports and coastal facilities. Then it attacked RAF bases, crippling the RAF's ability to defend the nation. And it looked like Hitler's Great British Invasion was coming. But then, Churchill ordered a small, pretty insignificant bombing raid over Berlin. It didn't do much damage, but Hitler was furious, and he immediately ordered the Luftwaffe to refocus its attacks on civilian targets in London. Children were sent off to the countryside away from their parents to avoid danger, and frequent trips to air raid shelters became a daily occurrence. But British morale held firm. Smiling, knitting, lounging casually, these people have balls of steel. This refocusing on London also gave the RAF breathing space to reorganize, so Hitler kind of shot himself in the foot there. Just the foot for now. Finally, the Luftwaffe sent one massive all-out attack on London, and the RAF successfully repelled it, destroying many of the German aircraft and placing air superiority firmly in British hands. Hitler's invasion had to be postponed, but
So Britain is able to resist, completely surrendering, and fight back the Germans. They're able to win this Battle of Britain. They're able to win airspace superiority. That's a big, big moment. Of course, as they showed, a big part of that is the sort of British citizenry being willing to resist and hold out under war. You know, once again, not like they had much of a choice, apart from complete surrender, which is what Hitler would have wanted, but since they were committed to resisting, everyone really holds up pretty strongly during this period. They're actually able to essentially win this phase of the conflict. Though, if you're Britain in this moment, things are still not looking super great for you. But of course, things change over time.
Bombing of British cities continued for some time.
Alrighty, that is part 1 of the Second World War by Oversimplified. Like I said in the beginning, a monumental conflict. Certainly had a good time with this one. If you guys did, I'd appreciate it if you'd leave a like, subscribe, and you can become a channel member if you'd like to see early access to my oversimplified reactions. With that, hope you guys are having a fantastic day today, and I'll see you all again next time. Goodbye.